Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're traveling through the entire history of the Plantagenets, the dynasty of lion-hearted kings, sacred crowns, whispered betrayals, and a war that lasted longer than a human lifetime. From the restless footsteps of Henry II and the rise of the Angevin Empire, to Richard the Lionheart crossing burning deserts, from the ink-stained fields of Magna Carta to the cold mud of Agincourt, and finally to the fading red and white roses at Bosworth, where a dynasty fell and the Tudors quietly rose from ash. This is the story of power, legacy, ambition, and the slow turning of the 100 Years' War, a saga of longbows humming in autumn wind, kings who believed themselves chosen by God, and rulers who stood in the mud beside their men. Tonight's journey is not about noise, it is about stillness between battles, the breath before an arrow is released, the silence inside a cathedral of stone, the winter wind moving through empty castles after crowns have fallen. This is deep sleep history, where even the greatest storms of medieval England soften into something calm, reflective, and strangely comforting. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, let the torches dim, let the longbows fall silent, and allow the story of the Plantagenets, the dynasty of lion-hearted kings and the 100 Years' War, to carry you softly into the night. A man who never sat still, yet tonight we will watch him rest. The torches in the stone corridor have burned low, and somewhere beyond the thick castle walls, a horse gives a soft, weary whinny, the sound drifting gently across the courtyard like a sigh carried on cool English air. This is not the sound of clashing steel, nor the roar of armies gathering for conquest. It is quieter than that. It is the steady breath of a kingdom learning how to stand on its own feet. In the stillness of this imagined night, we begin the story of Henry II, the restless architect of what historians now call the Angevin Empire, and the living pulse behind what many search today as Henry II history. He was born in 1133 in Le Mans, heir to Anjou through his father Geoffrey Plantagenet, and to England through his mother, the formidable Empress Matilda. His childhood was shaped by civil war, the chaos remembered as the Anarchy, when England fractured between Stephen and Matilda. Yet Henry did not grow into a loud warlord craving spectacle. He became something rarer and, in its own way, more powerful, a ruler who understood that order could outlast any sword. Imagine him now, finally pausing at the edge of his bedchamber, boots dusted from endless travel. His cloak smells faintly of rain and horse sweat, not unpleasant, just honest. He has ridden across Normandy, across Anjou, across England itself, refusing to remain confined to a single throne room. Administration, not glory, was his battlefield. Scrolls lie rolled upon a heavy oak table nearby, parchment slightly curled, the scent of old ink and sheepskin rising softly in the dim light. Henry II strengthened royal justice, sending traveling judges across the realm so that law no longer belonged solely to local lords. The Assize of Clarendon and the development of common law were not dramatic in the way battles are dramatic, but they reshaped England more deeply than most victories in war. This is the quiet revolution within Henry II history. the idea that the king's law could reach every corner of the land. And beside him, though not physically present in this quiet chamber, stands the memory of Eleanor of Aquitaine, a presence as vast as any territory. Their marriage in 1152 brought not only passion and turbulence, but lands that stretched from the Scottish border deep into France. Through Eleanor, Henry gained Anjou, and together they formed a dominion that rivaled the Capetian kings of France in wealth and reach. If you listen carefully, you might almost hear the faint rustle of Eleanor's silk gowns in some distant hall, the echo of her intelligence shaping courts and culture. She was not merely a consort, she was a force. In 29 Henry II history accounts and beyond, scholars debate his temper, his ambition, his conflict with Thomas Becket. But tonight we do not dwell on the clash in Canterbury Cathedral. Instead, we observe the exhaustion behind the authority. The man who would reform a kingdom had to live within it, breathe its damp air, ride its muddy roads. His tunic is simple for a king, wool dyed in deep earth tones, practical rather than flamboyant. His fingers, ink-stained from reviewing writs, rest briefly against the cool stone window ledge. Outside, the moonlight falls across a courtyard that belongs not just to England, but to a web of territories bound by loyalty, negotiation, and constant vigilance. The Angevin Empire was never a single unified state in the modern sense. It was a living network, held together by Henry's movement, his decisions, his refusal to be idle. That is why the Hook matters, a man who never sits still, yet tonight we let him sit. We let him close his eyes, if only for a moment, while the parchment waits and the horses sleep. Because in this pause, we understand the weight he carried. The dynasty of lion-hearted kings would follow, but its foundation was laid not by roaring lions alone, but by the steady, relentless mind of Henry II. The night deepens, and the castle settles into that rare hour when even ambition seems to soften. Henry II does not truly sleep the way other men sleep. Even in rest, his mind travels. If we remain beside him in this quiet chamber, we begin to sense how the Angevin Empire was less a possession and more a responsibility that pressed gently yet constantly upon his chest. Outside, a stable boy moves carefully through straw, the faint shuffle of boots and the warm breath of horses filling the air with a comforting rhythm. This is the soundscape of power maintained not by spectacle, but by routine. In the broader sweep of Henry II history, it is tempting to leap toward rebellion, toward the drama of sons rising against their father, toward the shadow of the 100 Years' War that would define later generations of Plantagenets. But here, in this first chapter, the story is more intimate. Henry's empire stretched across England, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and through Eleanor of Aquitaine, deep into Aquitaine itself. It was a lattice of loyalties, oaths, and negotiations. There were no borders marked by neat lines on maps. There were instead rivers crossed at dawn, halls entered at dusk, charters sealed by candlelight. Imagine the texture of those charters: thick parchment, edges slightly rough, impressed with wax bearing the royal seal. The scent of melted wax mingles with the lingering aroma of old leather bindings. Henry's reforms were not abstract ideas. They were physical acts repeated thousands of times. Writs issued, cases heard, sheriffs appointed, judges sent riding across muddy roads to ensure that royal justice became a living presence. This steady expansion of common law would echo long after his death, shaping not only England, but legal traditions far beyond. The SEO term Henry II history often draws readers toward his conflict with Thomas Becket, And yes, that tragedy would stain his reign. But even that event reveals something deeper about Henry: his frustration with limits, his desire to centralize authority, his belief that governance required coherence. He was not content to let the church operate entirely outside royal influence. His quarrel with Becket was not simply personal, it was structural, a question of where power truly resided. And yet, when Becket fell in Canterbury Cathedral, the shock rippled through Christendom. Henry's authority trembled. In penance, he walked barefoot to the cathedral and submitted to ritual scourging. Even kings could bleed. That moment, too, belongs within Henry II history, not as spectacle, but as vulnerability. Meanwhile, Eleanor of Aquitaine remained a formidable presence. Their partnership had once seemed unbreakable, but ambition within a dynasty can become its own storm. Their sons, including Richard, who would one day be remembered as Lionheart, absorbed both the strength and tension of their parents. The Angevin Empire was vast, but it was also fragile, dependent on personal bonds. Henry's endless travel was not merely preference, it was necessity. To rule such territories, he had to be seen. He had to remind barons and bishops alike that the king was not distant parchment, but living authority. If you listen closely, you might hear the faint crackle of a hearth in some Norman keep, the murmur of advisors discussing revenues, the scratch of quills across vellum. These were the true battlegrounds of his reign. And in these small, persistent acts, the dynasty of lion-hearted kings took root. The Plantagenet story would eventually blaze with crusades and continental wars, culminating in the 100 Years' War. But those later conflicts were shaped by structures Henry built: administrative cohesion, legal centralization, territorial ambition. So tonight, as the torches finally dim and Henry's breathing grows steady, we see him not as a roaring lion, but as a weary architect. His boots rest beside the bed, mud dried along their seams. His cloak lies folded, heavy with the memory of miles traveled. The empire he forged does not sleep, but for a moment its creator does. And in that pause, we understand that history is not only forged in battle, but in the quiet persistence of a ruler who refused to remain still. When dawn finally brushes the horizon, it does not arrive with trumpets. It arrives softly, as pale light slips across stone and settles on the quiet figure of a king who has carried more land in his mind than most men could carry in their arms. Henry II will rise again soon, and the rhythm of hooves and parchment will resume. But history does not pause with one man. It flows forward like mist lifting from a river valley in Anjou. And in that mist, another presence begins to take shape. A son watches. Richard, not yet the Lionheart of legend, stands at the edge of inheritance. In the gentle unfolding of Henry II history, we begin to sense that the empire built through tireless governance will one day be tested by a different kind of energy. Richard's childhood was not one of stillness. He inherited from his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, a fierce imagination and a love for the poetry of chivalry. From his father, he inherited ambition and expectation. If Henry ruled through movement and administration, Richard felt drawn toward glory and the language of crusade. Yet tonight, in our slow unfolding story, he is not yet marching beneath banners. He is a young noble moving through echoing corridors, the scent of rushes and beeswax candles lingering in the air. The Angevin Empire surrounds him not as a battlefield, but as a vast inheritance. Tapestries depicting hunts and saints line the walls. Armor rests silent upon wooden stands. Outside, falcons perch calmly, their feathers catching early light. This is the stillness before reputation. The term lion-hearted kings would eventually define Richard in chronicles, but that title did not begin with a roar. It began in the tension between father and son. Henry II, for all his brilliance, struggled to manage the ambitions of his heirs. The empire was so vast that it required delegation, and delegation invited rivalry. Henry named his sons to titles while retaining true authority, a strategy designed to maintain unity, but which quietly seeded resentment. In 29 Henry II history narratives, scholars describe the revolt of 1173, when Richard and his brothers rose against their father with encouragement from Eleanor of Aquitaine herself. Yet even rebellion, when viewed through the lens of sleep and distance, becomes less a spectacle and more a human ache. Imagine the quiet after a heated council, when doors close and footsteps fade. The son who longs to prove himself, the father who refuses to release control. Their conflict is not only political, it is generational. The horses in the stable do not know which banner they will one day carry. The parchment in the treasury does not choose sides, but the empire feels the strain. And here, in the gentle progression toward what will one day become the 100 Years' War, we see the fragile thread binding the Plantagenets. Henry's creation depended on cohesion. Richard's destiny would depend on expansion and reputation. The Angevin Empire, so carefully administered, was not a nation united by shared identity. It was a collection of territories held through feudal bonds and personal loyalty. When those loyalties trembled, the structure itself trembled. The SEO phrase 5-1 Eleanor of Aquitaine often draws attention to her extraordinary life, and rightly so. She was Queen of France, then Queen of England, mother to kings, patron of culture, and political strategist. In this quiet dawn, she exists as both bridge and storm. Her court in Aquitaine nurtured troubadours and ideals of romantic knighthood that shaped Richard's imagination. Through her, the Plantagenet dynasty acquired not only land, but legend. The air in the corridor grows warmer as morning fires are lit. Servants move quietly, careful not to disturb the fragile balance of hierarchy. Somewhere a bell tolls faintly. Henry II will awaken to another day of calculation. Richard will awaken to another day of restless anticipation. And we, as gentle observers, understand something essential. The dynasty of lion-hearted kings did not spring fully formed from battlefields. It grew from sleepless nights, from strained conversations, from the weight of inheritance pressing upon young shoulders. The 100 Years' War lies far ahead, like a distant horizon barely visible through morning haze. Yet its roots are already present in this family, in these lands stretching across sea and river. So, as the castle fully wakes and the first rays of sunlight spill across banners bearing the Plantagenet emblem, we do not rush forward. We linger. We breathe with the rhythm of hooves being saddled once more. We feel the quiet persistence that binds father and son, ambition and structure. History moves, but slowly, gently, as though careful not to wake the world too abruptly. From deep green oak forests to burning golden dunes, the journey of a king stretches farther than any crown was meant to carry. The castle we left at dawn slowly fades behind us, replaced by the rhythmic sway of ships crossing cold gray waters. Richard, now crowned and no longer the restless sun in shadow, stands at the edge of the deck, wind tugging at his cloak. The English air that once smelled of damp earth and moss has given way to salt and tar and distant horizons. In the unfolding arc of 59 Richard the Lionheart, this is where legend begins to separate from home. Yet before banners rise in desert heat, there is the silence of departure. The oak beams of the ship creak softly beneath armored weight. Sailcloth snaps gently overhead. Somewhere below deck, a soldier murmurs a prayer not for glory, but for safe return. Richard's face, often painted in chronicles as fierce and resolute, is tonight turned toward memory. England remains behind him, not merely as territory, but as responsibility. The Angevin inheritance his father forged now rests upon his shoulders, yet he leaves it to others while he sails toward Jerusalem. The Third Crusade was not a distant rumor, it was a call that reverberated through Christendom after the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187. In the wider lens of 54 Crusades history, Richard's expedition stands as one of the most storied chapters. But beneath the spectacle of armored knights and clashing empires lies a quieter truth. A king must leave his own hearth to defend a sacred one thousands of miles away. The green of England's forests becomes memory. The air grows warmer with each southern port. By the time Richard's forces reach the shores of the Levant, the world has changed color. Stone fortresses shimmer beneath an unforgiving sun. Sand clings to boots the way English mud once did, but the heat is relentless, pressing against armor, seeping into breath. The contrast is not merely geographical, it is emotional. In England, bells toll through mist and rain. In the Holy Land, the call to prayer floats across dry air at dusk. Richard moves through both worlds, but belongs fully to neither. He is King of England, Duke of Aquitaine, lord of vast territories, yet he spends barely 6 months of his 10-year reign on English soil. For many modern listeners, especially men who know what it means to work far from home, this detail resonates quietly. The crown demands absence, the title demands sacrifice. Richard's knights in the East are not filled only with strategy and ambition, they are filled with distance, letters carried by ship, news delayed by months, the knowledge that storms or politics might undo what he cannot see. In 59 Richard the Lionheart accounts, historians recount his courage at the siege of Acre and the Battle of Arsuf. They speak of his martial brilliance, his ability to inspire loyalty. Yet when we soften the focus, we see something more intimate. A king sitting beneath a canvas tent as desert wind brushes against fabric. The scent of dust replaces the scent of oak. Armor once cold in English rain now burns beneath the sun. He carries not only a sword but expectation. The crusade promises salvation, honor, and legacy, but it also demands endurance. And so the lion-hearted king begins to understand that courage is not only the roar before battle, it is the quiet endurance of distance. The desert does not sleep the way forests do. In England, night falls gently, wrapping oak branches in silver mist, dampening sound until even footsteps soften against moss. But here, in the Holy Land, darkness feels vast and exposed. The sky stretches endlessly, scattered with sharp stars that seem closer than they ever appeared above Norman keeps. Richard lies awake beneath canvas, armor resting beside him, sword within reach. The heat of the day lingers in the sand, radiating upward even as cool air drifts across the camp. In the long arc of Crusades history, we often remember the clash of steel and the triumphant march at Arsuf. Yet we rarely linger in these quiet hours when a king faces his own solitude. The crusade was a campaign of banners and vows, but it was also a test of endurance. Supplies dwindled, allies quarreled, disease whispered through tents more efficiently than any enemy scout. The language of Crusades history speaks of strategy and siege engines, but tonight we focus on the stillness between battles. Richard listens to the distant murmur of men speaking in French, Occitan, English. He hears accents from across his Angevin inheritance, woven together by faith and fealty. Yet unity is fragile in foreign heat. Each knight carries his own fears. Each soldier dreams of fields far away. For Richard,
The desert magnifies responsibility. He is not merely a warrior, he is the embodiment of his realm. When he rides into battle, thousands follow not just his command, but his courage. That weight presses differently in the East. In England, he could rely on stone walls and inherited authority. Here, authority must be proven daily beneath relentless sun. At Acre, the siege stretched on for months. The air thickened with tension and decay. Richard's arrival electrified the crusading host. Chronicles describe his energy, his impatience, his refusal to accept stagnation. But beneath that fierce momentum lies a quieter layer. Imagine him removing his gauntlets at dusk, fingers raw from gripping reins and steel. Imagine the faint scent of leather mingling with desert wind. He is far from the green rivers of Aquitaine, far from the cold stone chapels where bells once marked his hours. News from home travels slowly, and sometimes not at all. His younger brother John maneuvers politically in England. Philip II of France, once ally, becomes rival. Even in victory, Richard is surrounded by uncertainty. The king who appears lion-hearted in manuscripts is, in these private hours, simply a man awake beneath foreign constellations. And perhaps this is why his legend endures, because courage is most visible when contrasted with vulnerability. In the wider sweep of history's Crusades, Richard never recaptured Jerusalem. Negotiation replaced conquest. Truces were signed. The campaign became less about triumph and more about survival and honor. Some later writers judged this harshly. Yet when we soften the narrative, we see wisdom in endurance. Richard secured access for Christian pilgrims. He preserved dignity where absolute victory proved impossible. He understood, perhaps reluctantly, that kingship sometimes means accepting limits. The sand shifts underfoot as guards rotate watch. A camel groans softly beyond the perimeter. Richard closes his eyes briefly, not in deep sleep, but in measured rest. The oak forests of England feel impossibly distant, yet they remain within him. He carries them as memory, as anchor. The contrast shapes him. The Lionheart is not forged solely in combat, but in isolation, in the quiet awareness that leadership often requires standing alone so others may stand together.
When at last the desert wind begins to feel familiar rather than foreign, a different longing takes root. It is not the longing for glory that first carried Richard across the sea. It is the quieter ache of return. Campaigns end not always with trumpets, but with negotiations, exhaustion, and the slow realization that even lion-hearted kings are bound by time. The Third Crusade did not deliver Jerusalem back into Christian hands, yet it forged something else within Richard. In the layered tapestry of 59 Richard the Lionheart, we see not only the warrior, but the traveler who learned that distance reshapes a man. The truce with Saladin secured safe passage for pilgrims, and though some chroniclers framed it as compromise, it was in truth a recognition of reality. The desert had taught him that leadership is not always conquest, sometimes it is endurance with dignity. As ships once again gather along the Mediterranean coast, sails prepared for the long journey home, Richard stands facing west. The air smells of brine and dust, different from the damp English harbors he left years earlier. Armor is worn thinner now, scratched and dulled by sun and sand. His beard is touched by hardship, his gaze steadier, less impatient. In the broader sweep of 59 Crusades history, this return marks a pivot, yet even the journey back would not grant him simple relief. Storms scatter fleets, politics complicate routes. Captured and imprisoned in Europe, Richard becomes a king without a throne for a time, his ransom weighing heavily upon England. The irony is sharp. The lion who faced desert armies is confined within stone walls not far from home. And here the emotional thread tightens. For many men who have labored far from their families, who have carried burdens across distance only to find new trials waiting, Richard's story resonates quietly. Responsibility does not end at victory, it transforms. In captivity, he is no longer surrounded by banners snapping in desert wind. Instead, there is the echo of footsteps in narrow corridors, the chill of continental stone, the faint smell of candle smoke in confined air. The oak forests of England remain unseen, yet he endures, trusting that loyalty and coin will secure his release. When ransom is paid and he returns briefly to his realm, he does not linger long. Conflict in France calls him again. The Plantagenet inheritance demands vigilance. The 100 Years' War lies generations ahead, but the tensions between England and France are already tightening like drawn bowstrings. Richard's campaigns in France reflect a pattern first set by his father: mobility, assertion, refusal to yield ground easily. Yet, unlike Henry II, whose power was rooted in administration, Richard's legacy is forged in perception. The image of the Lionheart spreads through songs and chronicles, carried by troubadours who once sang in Eleanor of Aquitaine's courts. Legend amplifies what distance made poignant. He becomes the archetype of chivalric kingship, brave, direct, untamed. And yet, if we listen beneath the poetry, we hear the cost. Years spent away from England, a kingdom governed largely in absence, a life measured not by peaceful winters in oak-shadowed halls, but by campaigns under foreign skies. Desert to Mediterranean and back again to contested French fortresses, Richard's path forms a bridge between generations. He does not live to see the long arc of the 100 Years' War, but his reign sharpens the rivalry that will define it. When he falls in 1199 from a wound taken at Challis, the lion's roar fades not with thunder, but with a quiet breath. The desert wind, the sea salt, the English rain, all have shaped him. And as night settles once more over a Plantagenet castle, we understand that legend often grows from loneliness carried with courage. The lion-hearted king was never only a warrior of sand and steel. He was a man who bore distance as part of duty, who stood between forest and desert, between home and horizon, and in doing so, became memory.
On the muddy field of Runnymede, history was written not in blood, but in ink. The rain does not fall gently this day. It falls with weight, steady and persistent, turning grass into slick earth and silk cloaks into darkened cloth. The banners of England hang heavy with water, their colors muted beneath gray skies. There is no desert wind here, no blazing sun reflecting off armor. Instead, there is cold, damp air that seeps into bone and patience alike. We have left behind the lion-hearted image of Richard, whose life burned brightly across continents. Now we stand in a quieter, heavier moment of Plantagenet history, beneath clouds that refuse to part. The throne has passed to his younger brother, and in the unfolding story of 59 King John, we encounter a ruler shaped not by crusading glory, but by inheritance, shadowed by comparison. John was not the firstborn son expected to rule. He grew up observing brothers destined for prominence, watching Richard claim admiration through action. When power finally rested in his hands in 1199, it arrived amid instability. Territories in France slipped away under the determined advance of Philip II. The Angevin Empire, once expansive under Henry II, began to fracture. In the slow cadence of heavy rain ambiance, we imagine John standing beneath a canopy at Runnymede,
droplets sliding from its edges in rhythmic patterns. His cloak clings to his shoulders. The barons facing him are equally soaked, their frustration as thick as the mud beneath their boots. In the larger frame of 52 Magna Carta history, this moment is often summarized as a confrontation between king and nobility, but in truth, it feels more like exhaustion than fury. Years of military failure, heavy taxation, and mistrust have brought them here. The River Thames moves sluggishly nearby, swollen with rain, reflecting the overcast sky in dull silver. There are no cheering crowds, only scribes, inkpots carefully shielded from water, and parchment waiting to absorb words that will echo for centuries. John's reign had been marked by conflict not only abroad but at home. Disputes with the church led to England placed under interdict. Noble families bristled under financial demands meant to fund lost wars. In 59 King John discussions, historians often debate whether he was tyrant or pragmatist, victim of circumstance or architect of his own downfall. But tonight, we do not judge, we observe. We hear rain striking canvas. We hear horses shifting uneasily in the distance. The Magna Carta was not envisioned as a universal declaration of human rights. It was a negotiated settlement, a document born from tension and necessity. Yet its significance grew beyond its muddy origins. As the parchment is unrolled beneath shelter, we sense the fragility of ink against moisture. Each line, carefully written, carries weight not of swords, but of agreement. The barons demand recognition of limits. The king, cornered yet still sovereign, presses his seal into wax. In that simple act, beneath heavy rain ambiance, the idea takes root that even a monarch must answer to law. The field of Runnymede becomes less a battlefield and more a threshold. The rain softens voices, it blurs sharp edges, and as history shifts from conquest to constraint, we feel the mood of England change. The lion's roar fades into the steady rhythm of rainfall. Power does not disappear, it transforms. The rain does not stop when the seal is pressed. It continues, patient and unhurried, as though nature itself wishes to wash the moment into memory. The parchment of the Magna Carta, still damp at its edges despite careful sheltering, rests upon a wooden table hastily assembled on the sodden ground. Ink glistens briefly before settling into the fibers of vellum. Around it, barons lower their voices, not out of reverence, but out of fatigue. In the long echo of 52 Magna Carta history, this scene is often dramatized as triumph over tyranny. Yet when we allow ourselves to listen to the heavy rain ambiance, the story feels more fragile than victorious. King John stands not as a monster nor as a martyr, but as a ruler caught between expectation and erosion. His authority, once assumed to be absolute, now reveals its limits. The field at Runnymede becomes a mirror of the realm itself, saturated, unstable, yet capable of growth once the storm passes. The Thames nearby swells and murmurs, carrying rainwater downstream as if bearing witness. John's reign had been shaped by military losses in Normandy and Anjou, territories once held firmly by his father Henry II. In the shadow of 59 King John, these defeats weigh heavily. To fund campaigns meant to reclaim lost lands, he imposed scutage and levies that strained loyalty. Each coin demanded deepened resentment. Each failed siege hardened distrust. The conflict with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury left England under interdict for years. Church bells silenced, marriages performed without celebration, burials conducted without ceremony. Imagine the hush of a village where bells no longer ring.
Imagine rain falling against chapel walls without the comforting echo of sound within. It is within this atmosphere that the Magna Carta was born, not in idealism, but in necessity, not in applause, but in exhaustion. The clauses written upon that parchment addressed specific grievances: protection from unlawful imprisonment, assurance of due process, limitations on certain taxes without common counsel. To modern ears, these phrases carry the seed of constitutional governance, but to those present beneath the storm, they were practical demands to restrain instability. The king's seal, pressed into wax, does not signify surrender so much as recalibration. Authority bends in order to endure. In 52 Magna Carta history discussions, scholars often remind us that the document was annulled shortly after its signing, that civil war followed, that peace was not immediate. Yet even annulled promises can alter imagination. The very act of negotiation reshaped expectation. The idea that a monarch could be compelled to acknowledge law planted itself firmly in English soil, watered by rain and memory alike. John himself would not enjoy long respite. Rebellion flared, French intervention threatened. As we sit quietly within this damp tableau, we sense not resolution, but transition. The lion-hearted blaze of Richard's era has faded. In its place stands a colder truth. Governance without trust erodes from within. The rain softens footprints, blurring the evidence of who stood where. But the parchment remains. Ink, though vulnerable to moisture, endures longer than steel when carefully preserved. And so, beneath gray skies and heavy clouds, a precedent is set. Kingship in England begins to shift from divine assertion toward negotiated responsibility. The field of Runnymede, soaked and unremarkable in appearance, becomes sacred not through spectacle, but through implication. The rain continues its steady rhythm, as if inviting us to close our eyes and let the sound carry us forward into a new chapter of Plantagenet history.
The rain eventually softens, though the clouds linger low over Runnymede, as if reluctant to leave the scene they had witnessed. Water gathers in shallow pools across the field, reflecting fragments of sky and the faint silhouettes of departing riders. The barons disperse slowly, hooves pressing deep into mud that will soon swallow their tracks. King John mounts his horse without ceremony. There is no triumph in his posture, no dramatic gesture of reconciliation. Only the quiet knowledge that something irreversible has occurred. In the continuing arc of 59 King John, this moment does not bring stability. Instead, it opens a fragile path forward, uncertain and uneven. The Magna Carta, born in rain and tension, is not yet secure. Within months it will be contested, annulled, revived, reshaped. Civil war will simmer beneath its clauses. Yet even amid turbulence, the idea it introduced cannot be entirely erased. In the broader reflection of 52 Magna Carta history, we recognize that its power lies not in immediate perfection, but in persistent return. Each reissue under later monarchs reinforces its symbolism. Each generation reads into it new meaning. What began as a baronial safeguard gradually becomes a cornerstone of constitutional thought. Imagine the parchment drying in a dim chamber, ink settling fully into vellum fibers. Outside, England remains restless. Castles fortify themselves, alliances shift. But somewhere within the kingdom, scribes copy the text again, preserving language that asserts limitation over absolute will. For John himself, the years following Runnymede are marked by struggle. French forces land in support of rebellious barons. The crown's authority fractures further. In 1216, ill and worn, John retreats eastward through rain-soaked countryside. The weather seems unwilling to relent. Chronicles speak of lost treasure wagons swallowed by marshland, of fever and fatigue overtaking the king. Whether embellished or precise, these images carry a poetic symmetry. The ruler who once resisted constraint is now constrained by circumstance and mortality. In his final days at Newark Castle, there are no grand speeches, only the fading rhythm of breath against stone walls. The heavy rain ambience that accompanied Magna Carta seems to echo once more, not as accusation, but as accompaniment. John's death leaves the throne to his young son, Henry III, a child upon whom the future must now depend. And here, as we allow the sound of distant rainfall to settle into a softer patter, we sense continuity rather than conclusion. The Plantagenet dynasty does not end with failure, it adapts. Under Henry III and later Edward I, Magna Carta will be reaffirmed, embedded deeper into political consciousness. The field of Runnymede will transform from muddy compromise into sacred memory. The idea that law stands above ruler begins to shape the English identity in subtle but enduring ways. From lion-hearted conquest to rain-soaked negotiation, the dynasty evolves. The 100 Years' War lies ahead, fueled by claims and counterclaims rooted in inheritance and sovereignty. Yet the framework for debating power has changed. No longer is kingship simply the roar of dominance. It is the careful balancing of authority and accountability. As night falls once more over the English countryside, the rain has thinned to a gentle whisper against rooftops. The Thames flows steadily, indifferent yet eternal. We close this chapter not with spectacle, but with reflection. On a muddy field, beneath gray skies, history shifted quietly, not through swords raised high, but through ink pressed firmly into parchment. And in that quiet act, amid heavy rain and human frailty, a new rhythm of governance began to beat within the heart of England.
When swords are sheathed, stones begin to rise. The rain that once soaked Runnymede has faded into memory, and with it the sharp tension of rebellion. England does not become peaceful overnight, yet there is a subtle shift in the air. The clang of armor grows less frequent. The echo of legal debate settles into routine. And into this quieter landscape steps Henry III, a child king who would grow into one of the longest reigning monarchs in medieval England. If the reign of his father, King John, was defined by storm and fracture, Henry's life would be defined by duration. His story does not roar, it endures. Crowned in 1216 at just 9 years old, Henry inherited not stability, but possibility. Magna Carta, reissued in his minority, became both shield and framework. As regents governed in his name, the kingdom slowly steadied, and as he matured, so too did his vision of kingship. In the wide lens of Westminster Abbey history, Henry III emerges not as conqueror, but as builder. His devotion to Edward the Confessor shaped his imagination. He saw kingship not only as authority over land, but as stewardship over sacred space. And so, when the noise of conflict softened, he turned his gaze towards stone. Imagine London in the 13th century, its narrow streets alive with merchants and craftsmen, its river carrying both commerce and quiet reflection. Amid this living city stands the old Romanesque Abbey of Westminster, worn by time. Henry dreams not of modest repair, but of transformation. The style he chooses is Gothic, inspired by the soaring cathedrals of France. In 52 medieval architecture studies, scholars describe the shift from heavy, rounded arches to pointed vaults, from thick walls to luminous stained glass. But tonight we do not analyze, we listen. We hear the soft scrape of chisels against limestone. We hear the muted thud of mallets shaping blocks into symmetry. Stone by stone, the Abbey rises. The air within is cool even in summer. Dust settles gently in shafts of light streaming through unfinished windows. There is no battlefield here, no banners snapping in wind, only patience. Henry walks slowly along scaffolding, robes brushing against rough timber. His face reflects not urgency, but contemplation. Where Richard sought glory in distant lands, Henry seeks permanence in sacred walls. The new Westminster Abbey will not be built in a year, nor even a decade. It will grow across time, much like Henry's reign itself. The deep sleep of architecture begins here. Stone absorbs sound. Vaulted ceilings soften echoes. Colored glass, when installed, will filter sunlight into blues and reds that drift like quiet prayers across the floor. In the long arc of Plantagenet history, this moment marks a pause in outward conquest and a turn inward toward legacy. Henry III may not dominate chronicles with dramatic victories, but his devotion to sacred construction anchors the dynasty in continuity. From Magna Carta's parchment to carved tracery in stone, England begins to define itself not only through law, but through space. And as twilight settles over the Thames, the unfinished Abbey stands calm against the fading sky. The kingdom breathes differently now. Less storm, more stillness. The swords remain within their scabbards, and the stones, cool and deliberate, continue to rise.
The rhythm of chisels becomes a kind of heartbeat for the kingdom. Long after the memory of civil war has faded into softened chronicles, the sound of stone being shaped continues day after day, season after season. Westminster does not rise in haste. It grows the way forests grow, quietly and with intention. Henry III, now no longer the child crowned in uncertainty, walks through the half-finished nave with measured steps. His fingers trail along cool limestone columns that stretch upward like pale trunks of an eternal grove. In the unfolding meditation of 58 Westminster Abbey history, this is not merely construction, it is devotion translated into architecture. The Gothic style Henry embraces is unlike the heavy Romanesque forms before it. Instead of thick, grounded arches, there are pointed vaults that seem to lift the eye toward heaven. Instead of narrow windows, there will be expanses of stained glass that dissolve sunlight into gentle colors. In 58 medieval architecture discussions, scholars speak of structural innovation, of ribbed vaults and flying buttresses redistributing weight so that walls may open to light. But tonight, in this deep sleep chapter of our story, we feel those innovations rather than analyze them. The Abbey's interior becomes a sanctuary of echo and hush. Even the smallest whisper is softened beneath the vaults. Imagine stepping inside as twilight fades, when candles flicker against unfinished stone. Dust motes drift slowly in colored shafts of light. The air smells faintly of lime mortar and beeswax. Outside, London hums with commerce and quiet rivalry among nobles. Yet within these walls there is stillness. Henry III kneels before the shrine of Edward the Confessor, whose relics he intends to honor with greater splendor. His devotion is personal. He sees in Edward a model of sacred kingship, a ruler who balances authority with piety. If his father's reign was marked by confrontation and the necessity of Magna Carta, Henry's is marked by a desire to reconcile crown and sanctity. In the broader sweep of Plantagenet history, his reign is often criticized for political missteps, for tensions with barons that will later resurface under Simon de Montfort. Yet when viewed through the lens of architecture, we see another dimension. Buildings endure where arguments fade. The Abbey becomes not only a church, but a statement,
The monarchy roots itself in sacred continuity. As the years pass, the choir stalls are carved with intricate tracery. Pillars rise slender and luminous. The floor beneath reflects light in subtle patterns. Here, the dynasty finds a physical center. Coronations will echo beneath these arches. Royal burials will rest in quiet proximity to saints. In 58 Westminster Abbey history, the rebuilding under Henry III marks a turning point, transforming the Abbey into the spiritual heart of English monarchy. And so the deep sleep atmosphere thickens. Stone absorbs footsteps. The outside world feels distant. Even conflict, when it emerges again later in his reign, cannot entirely disrupt the serenity these walls cultivate. The Abbey stands as a reminder that power can express itself through beauty as well as decree. As night settles fully, the final candle in the nave trembles before going dark. The silence that follows is profound yet gentle. Henry's dream of sacred space continues to rise, in shadow, layer upon layer of carved stone reaching upward. In this hush, we sense the Plantagenet story entering a phase not of roar or rebellion, but of reflection and resonance. As years fold gently into decades, the stones of Westminster settle into permanence. What once rang with the sharp rhythm of chisels now holds a deeper silence, the kind that gathers beneath vaulted ceilings and lingers between pillars. Henry III grows older as the Abbey grows taller. The kingdom around him does not remain free from strain. Discontent among barons resurfaces. Simon de Montfort challenges royal authority. Parliament, in its early and fragile form, begins to take clearer shape. Yet within the cool hush of Westminster, time feels different. In the extended meditation of 58 Westminster Abbey history, the Abbey becomes not merely a building, but a vessel of continuity. Henry walks more slowly now. The confidence of youth has softened into reflection. He stands beneath stained glass that bathes the stone floor in deep blues and crimson golds. The light changes with the hour, moving quietly across carved capitals and sculpted faces of saints. In 52 medieval architecture, scholars often note how Gothic design lifts the spirit upward, how vertical lines guide the eye heavenward. But here, in this final deep sleep passage, the architecture does more than lift the eye. It stills the heart. The cold stone floor beneath Henry's steps carries the memory of every mason who shaped it. Each arch overhead distributes weight with quiet intelligence. There is harmony in proportion, balance in design. Outside, politics may fracture alliances, but inside these walls, geometry and devotion coexist in peace. Henry's reign, stretching over half a century, is not remembered for sweeping conquests. It is remembered for endurance, for the slow shaping of governance and sacred space alike. The Magna Carta, reissued under his minority, remains in circulation, evolving into a symbol larger than its clauses. The Abbey he rebuilt becomes the ceremonial heart of England. In the long story of the Plantagenets, Henry III represents something easily overlooked in chronicles obsessed with war: patience. He understands that legacy can be carved, not only claimed. As twilight gathers once more along the Thames, the bells of Westminster ring gently through cool evening air. Their sound is not urgent, it drifts outward in calm waves. Future kings will be crowned here. Edward I will walk these aisles. Later, in centuries to come, the echoes of the 100 Years' War will resound beneath these arches. Yet the Abbey will remain steady, stone against storm. From the muddy negotiation of Magna Carta to the luminous serenity of Gothic vaults, England's identity continues to refine itself. Authority is no longer defined solely by sword or seal. It is expressed in ritual, in architecture, in continuity. As Henry III kneels once more before the shrine of Edward the Confessor, his breath slow and measured, we sense the closing of a quiet chapter. Not dramatic, not thunderous, but foundational. The swords are sheathed, the stones have risen, and in the deep hush of Westminster, where colored light rests upon ancient walls, the Plantagenet dynasty finds its center, not in conquest, but in construction. The air cools, candles flicker low. The Thames flows steadily beyond the Abbey's shadow. And as sleep gently approaches, we carry with us the image of stone layered upon stone, faith layered upon law, endurance layered upon ambition. In this stillness, history rests.
A long shadow falls across the mist of Scotland. It does not rush forward like a sudden storm. It stretches slowly, deliberately, as though cast by a figure who understands the weight of distance. The quiet hush of Westminster still lingers in our memory, stone resting upon stone in sacred calm. But history rarely remains still for long. From the cool serenity of Gothic vaults, we now step into a colder wind that moves northward, across hills wrapped in fog and valleys threaded with rivers. The man casting that shadow is Edward I, remembered in chronicles as the Longshanks king. His nickname, Longshanks, speaks first of height, of a physical presence that commanded attention. Yet his greater stature lay in resolve. He was not merely the heir to Henry III's patience, it was its transformation into steel. As we begin this chapter, let the voice slow, let it deepen. Imagine Edward riding through the northern countryside, armor gleaming beneath overcast skies, breath rising in pale clouds before him. His horse moves with steady rhythm, hooves muffled by damp earth. The land itself seems to listen. England under Edward is no longer tentative, it is consolidating. Laws are refined, administration strengthens, Parliament grows more defined. Yet Edward's reign is marked above all by expansion and assertion. In Wales, he builds castles that rise like stone teeth against the horizon. Carnarvon, Conway, Harlech, Beaumaris, each a testament to architectural dominance. But it is Scotland that will define his shadow most clearly. When the Scottish throne becomes contested after the death of Alexander III, Edward is invited to arbitrate among claimants. He accepts, but not as neutral judge. In the unfolding arc that later feeds into 58 Braveheart history, Edward demands acknowledgement as overlord. The Scottish nobles, divided and uncertain, concede for a moment. Yet beneath the mist, resistance breathes. Imagine the Highlands at dawn. Fog drifts low across heather. The air smells of peat and rain. Edward's army advances not with reckless fury, but with methodical certainty. He understands siege, supply, discipline. Where earlier Plantagenets sought glory in distant deserts or sacred stone, Edward seeks control in contested terrain. His campaigns are calculated, his will unwavering. In English chronicles, he appears as restorer of order. In Scottish memory, he becomes something harsher, the hammer of the Scots. The contrast is sharp, yet our tone remains calm. We do not shout history, we cradle it. Edward's presence in Scotland is not chaotic,
It is deliberate. He removes the Stone of Scone, symbol of Scottish kingship, and carries it south to Westminster. The act is symbolic, almost ritualistic. Power is not merely exercised, it is displayed. In 58 Edward Longshanks accounts, historians debate his ruthlessness. His response to rebellion is swift. Executions follow uprisings. Authority is reinforced with severity. Yet even within severity, there is structure. Edward does not rule impulsively, he rules with a belief in hierarchy and law, even as he bends both toward expansion. As night settles over a Scottish encampment, we imagine Edward within his tent, candlelight flickering across maps. Outside, the wind moves through canvas with a low murmur. The mist returns, softening outlines of spears and banners. The long shadow stretches further still, and though it carries weight, it also carries purpose. From Westminster's stillness to Scotland's fog, the dynasty shifts again. The stones of Henry III remain firm behind us. Now the hammer of the North begins its measured strike.
The mist does not resist the hammer. It simply closes in around it. In the north, weather moves like breath, soft and constant, veiling hills and valleys in shifting gray. Edward I rides through it not as a reckless conqueror, but as a ruler convinced that unity must be enforced before it can be trusted. In the deeper layers of 58 Edward Longshanks, we begin to understand that his severity grows from a belief in order. He does not see himself as destroyer, he sees himself as architect of a realm that must not fracture again as it did under his grandfather's generation. Yet Scotland does not interpret his presence as structure, it feels like pressure, and pressure, applied long enough, produces resistance. The name William Wallace rises in this mist like a sudden spark. In the popular imagination shaped by 58 Braveheart history, Wallace becomes a symbol of defiance, of freedom shouted against authority. But beneath cinematic legend lies a more complex reality. Wallace was not born into royal claim, he was forged in response to occupation, in response to humiliation. When Edward's officials attempt to administer Scotland directly, resentment deepens. Taxes weigh heavily. Oaths of fealty feel foreign. The Highlands whisper of independence. Imagine a Scottish village at dusk, peat fires glowing low, families gathered in rough stone cottages. The wind outside carries rumors of rebellion. Somewhere beyond the hills, banners rise not in ceremonial display, but in protest. Edward's response is swift. At the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, his disciplined archers break the schiltron formations of Scottish spearmen. Strategy triumphs over courage in that moment. The field grows quiet afterward, mist reclaiming ground once stained with effort and loss. In English accounts, the victory confirms Edward's strength. In Scottish memory, it confirms sacrifice. Wallace's eventual capture and execution is brutal, meant as warning, yet history rarely bends fully to warning. In the long current of 58 Braveheart history, Wallace becomes martyr rather than caution, and Edward, in attempting to crush defiance, inadvertently sharpens its myth. Still, our tone remains steady, measured. Edward's governance extends beyond battlefield. He reforms law. He summons what becomes known as the Model Parliament in 1295, inviting representatives beyond nobles and clergy. His administrative reach is broad, his understanding of statecraft sophisticated. In England, he strengthens legal codification and royal oversight. He believes deeply in structure, and yet structure imposed without consent becomes brittle. As night settles once more over northern encampments, we imagine Edward older now, the long shadow stretching thinner but still firm. His armor feels heavier than it once did.
His breath, visible in cold air, carries a hint of age. The hammer of the Scots has not shattered Scotland, it has hardened it. The wind over the Highlands continues, indifferent to banners. Edward's campaigns carve castles and memories into landscape alike. From Caernarfon's battlements to Stirling's contested fields, stone and soil remember. In 5/8 Edward Longshanks, historians see both brilliance and severity intertwined. He builds systems that endure. He also sows grievances that will echo long after his passing. The contrast is profound, yet in our telling it is softened by reflection. Authority and resistance exist in dialogue, even when that dialogue is written in iron. And so, beneath the slow-moving clouds of Scotland, the long shadow persists, not as chaos, but as consequence. The long shadow does not disappear with a single victory, nor does it vanish with a single rebellion. It stretches into old age, into memory, into the quiet hours when even a powerful king must rest his sword hand. Edward I grows weary in body, though not in conviction. The campaigns in Scotland continue in cycles of advance and resistance. Robert the Bruce rises where Wallace once stood. The struggle becomes less a flare of rebellion and more a sustained contest of endurance. In the deeper reflection of 58 Edward Longshanks, we see a ruler who cannot easily yield. For Edward, sovereignty is not symbolic, it is territorial, legal, and absolute. And yet time, like mist, moves around even the firmest stone. Imagine Edward in his later years, riding north once more despite illness, determined to assert dominance over a land that refuses to remain subdued. The wind over the borderlands feels sharper now. The banners seem heavier. His body, once tireless, signals its limits. In 1307, as he advances again toward Scotland, Edward falls ill at Burgh by Sands. The Hammer of the Scots, as later generations call him, breathes his last not in triumphant conquest, but in campaign. His death is not dramatic in spectacle, it is solemn, quiet. The long shadow shortens with the setting of his life, yet its imprint remains across Britain. Castles stand where Welsh princes once ruled. Administrative reforms shape English governance. Parliament, though still evolving, carries forward a broader representation first formalized in his reign. In the expansive arc that will eventually feed into the 100 Years' War, Edward's assertion of royal authority sets a tone of confidence that future Plantagenets will inherit. But Scotland does not forget. In the currents of 58 Braveheart history, resistance does not dissolve, it matures. Robert the Bruce will secure victory at Bannockburn in 1314 under Edward's son. The hammer's echo becomes a reminder that force can compel obedience, but not always allegiance. And yet, in our measured telling, we hold both truths gently. Edward I was formidable. He strengthened English law, expanded parliamentary practice, and constructed a network of fortifications that endure centuries later. He was also uncompromising, his severity casting long consequences. As night falls over the northern hills, mist returns, curling around castle walls built under his command. The air is still. The wind carries distant sounds of water moving through glens. The contrast that defines this chapter remains clear. From the luminous peace of Westminster's stone to the austere silhouette of Caernarfon against a storm-gray sky, the Plantagenet dynasty evolves once more. Henry III built in devotion, Edward I built in dominance. Both shaped the realm. As we close this chapter, the voice remains steady, paternal, calm. The hammer of the North has fallen silent, Yet the structures he left behind, legal and literal, continue to stand. The long shadow fades into dusk, but the ground it covered remains changed. And in that transformation, beneath mist and memory, the dynasty prepares for its next turning.
So a war that would last longer than a single lifetime began on an autumn morning. The mist lay low across harvested fields, and dew clung to the edges of grass like fragile glass. There was no thunder at first, no clash, only breath in cool air, and the faint sound of leather being tightened, of armor settling into place. The long shadow of Edward the First has faded into memory, and now a new generation rises beneath a sky that does not yet know how many seasons it will witness. Edward the Third stands at the center of this quiet beginning. In the unfolding current of 100 Years' War, historians trace causes through inheritance, dynastic claim, and wounded pride. But here, in this gentle retelling, we do not begin with accusation, we begin with stillness. Edward III had been crowned young after the troubled reign of his father, Edward II. He grew into a king who believed deeply in lineage and legitimacy. Through his mother, Isabella of France, he carried a claim to the French throne. When the direct Capetian line ended, Edward asserted that blood could cross the Channel as easily as ships. France disagreed, and so a tension that had simmered for decades crystallized into open conflict. Yet on that first autumn morning, it feels less like a declaration and more like anticipation. Imagine English longbowmen standing in rows, their bows unstrung for the moment, tips resting gently against earth. The wind moves through tall grass with a soft murmur. Somewhere far ahead, beyond sight, French banners gather. In 5,600 Years' War discussions, the conflict is often summarized as a contest for territory and sovereignty. But at Cressy in 1346, before arrows flew, there was waiting. The string of a longbow drawn back does not snap immediately. It stretches, hums, vibrates in held tension. The air holds its breath with it. Edward III watches from a slight rise, not rushing, not shouting. His son, Edward of Woodstock, known to later generations as the 50 Black Prince, stands near him, young yet resolute. The nickname Black Prince would be attached to him later, perhaps from armor darkened in battle, perhaps from reputation. But on this morning, he is simply a prince learning what legacy feels like. The autumn light is pale and slanted, the ground firm from harvest. Longbows are raised in unison, a forest of curved wood bending toward sky. The sound is not violent, it is taut, a collective inhalation. In that pause, before release, the war becomes real. Not because of blood, but because of intention. Edward III believes his claim just. The French king Philip VI believes the same of his own right. Between them lies a channel crossed by ships and pride. The 100 Years' War will stretch beyond this field, beyond even Edward's life. It will define generations. But here, at its threshold, we dwell in quiet expectancy. The string hums in wind. The prince feels the weight of expectation on young shoulders, and the world waits, suspended in that single drawn breath. The breath is released, but not in chaos. The arrows leave the strings like a sigh carried by wind. At Cressy,
It is not the clash of steel that defines the moment, but the rhythm of longbows rising and falling, the repeated drawing of string against calloused fingers. In the wide arc of 100 Years' War, Crécy becomes one of the early turning points, yet in this telling, we remain in the spaces between impact and echo. The English archers, positioned carefully on higher ground, wait for the French advance. There is patience in their posture, a discipline learned over years of practice in quiet fields, drawing bows not for glory, but for skill. The French knights, armored and confident, move forward through soft earth still damp from rain. But it is the waiting that lingers longest in memory. The wind passes through feathers of arrows before they are loosed. The hum of tension vibrates softly, almost like a lullaby woven through autumn air. Edward III does not rush his command. He watches. He understands that wars are not only won by force, but by timing. And beside him, the young Black Prince witnesses the shape of destiny forming in silence before it erupts into history. Edward of Woodstock is still in his teens at Crécy, yet he commands a division of the army. There is a quiet test in this, not one of bravado, but of steadiness. When French pressure increases against his line, messages are sent to the king asking for reinforcements. Edward III refuses immediate intervention, not out of neglect, but out of faith. He trusts his son to stand, and in that trust lies a father's stern love, the kind that expects resilience. The prince remains, the line holds. In 100 Years' War narratives, this moment becomes symbolic of a new generation stepping forward. But beneath symbolism is something more intimate. Imagine the prince's heartbeat beneath armor, the weight of helm pressing against brow, the faint taste of metal in the air. Yet above it all, the steady repetition of longbows. Draw, pause, release. Draw, pause, release. The waiting between each volley stretches time itself. The battle will end with English victory. Crécy will cement Edward III's confidence and elevate the reputation of the Black Prince. But victory does not end war, it extends it. The 100 Years' War will continue through sieges, treaties, plagues, and fragile truces. It will outlive Edward III and even his son. The Channel will remain a corridor not only for ships, but for rivalry. Yet in this moment, on that autumn field, we do not rush forward to later chapters. We remain in the stillness after arrows fall and before the field is cleared. The air grows quieter, the hum fades. The long war has begun not with a roar, but with a series of measured breaths. And that is how it will endure, not in constant fury, but in recurring tension, released and drawn again across generations.
The autumn field of Crécy grows quiet again. But the quiet is different now. It is no longer the silence of anticipation, but the silence that follows recognition. Edward III understands that something larger than a single victory has begun. In the widening narrative of the 100 Years' War, Crécy is followed by Calais, by sieges that stretch across seasons, by treaties signed in halls heavy with candle smoke. Yet the essence of this long conflict remains rooted in that early pattern of tension and release. War becomes less a singular eruption and more a rhythm carried forward year after year. Edward III ages as the war matures. His confidence, reinforced by early triumphs, shapes England's identity into something more assertive.
The claim to the French throne is not abandoned. It becomes a thread woven into royal language, into coins, into banners bearing lilies beside leopards. Across the Channel, France reorganizes, adapts, endures. The war does not burn constantly. It flickers, dims, flares again. That is why it outlasts lifetimes. And within this vast unfolding, the figure of the Black Prince grows more defined. Edward of Woodstock becomes renowned not merely for battlefield presence, but for charisma and discipline. At Poitiers in 1356, he will capture the French king John II, a moment that shocks Europe. But even there, beyond the clash, imagine again the stillness before engagement. The prince seated on horseback, visor lifted, studying the horizon. The faint creak of leather, the distant call of a horn softened by distance. He is no longer the young figure beneath his father's watchful eye at Crécy. He is a commander in his own right. Yet there is solitude in command. The burden of expectation does not vanish with experience, it deepens. In the broader sweep of the 100 Years' War, historians often focus on territorial gains and diplomatic settlements. But in this quiet retelling, we focus on inheritance. Edward III passes not only a crown, but a conflict to his descendants. The Black Prince, though brilliant, will not live to become king. Illness shadows his later years, and the throne will pass to his son, Richard II. Thus, even amid triumph, fragility persists. The 100 Years' War becomes a backdrop against which generations measure themselves. It is not a single war, but a succession of campaigns, pauses, and renewed claims. And beneath it all, the longbow's hum remains symbolic. Drawn tension, measured release. A nation learning to define itself not solely by insular rule, but by continental ambition. As Edward III enters old age, the vigor of youth softens into contemplation. He has expanded England's prestige. He has bound his dynasty to a war that will shape Europe. Yet as evening settles over Windsor and the Thames flows steadily beyond castle walls, one senses a quieter truth. No king can see the full arc of a war that spans a century. Each plays a part, each inherits and passes forward. The Black Prince's armor may gleam dark against autumn light, but it too will one day rest silent. The Channel will continue to reflect moonlight long after banners have changed. And so this chapter closes not with noise, but with continuity. A war that began on an autumn morning continues beyond that season. A father who trusted his son leaves behind both glory and burden. The string has been drawn. It will be drawn again, across decades, across generations. In the soft echo of wind over distant fields, the Plantagenet dynasty prepares for trials yet to come.
A king who believed himself almost divine, and a king who stood in mud beside his soldiers. Between those two images lies a winter of the Plantagenet soul. The wind that once carried the hum of longbows across autumn fields now grows colder. Edward III has passed. The Black Prince is gone before wearing the crown. And so the weight of the 100 Years' War falls upon a young successor who was not meant to carry it so soon. Richard II ascends the throne as a child, delicate in age, refined in taste, and raised within the lingering glow of his grandfather's victories. In the deeper unfolding of the 100 Years' War, Richard's reign marks not expansion, but tension turned inward. He believes deeply in the sanctity of kingship. He cultivates ceremony. He surrounds himself with art, silk, ritual, and language that elevates monarchy toward the sacred.
In his mind, the king is not merely ruler, he is anointed, he is chosen. The winter imagery begins here, not in snow, but in distance. Richard rules with a sense of separation. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 shakes England early in his reign. Though he confronts the rebels personally and momentarily restores order, the fracture remains beneath the surface. In Chronicles, he is described as intelligent, eloquent, but increasingly authoritarian. He leans on favorites. He exiles rivals. He believes the crown exists above earthly limitation. Yet history, like winter, strips illusion. Power that sees itself as divine risks isolation. In our slow telling, imagine Richard standing in Westminster Hall, candlelight reflecting off polished floors. His robes are rich, embroidered with gold thread. His expression serene, almost distant. Outside, frost gathers along stone. Within, tension thickens unseen. He asserts royal prerogative, punishes dissent, and gradually alienates powerful nobles. Among them stands Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt. When Richard exiles Henry and later seizes his inheritance, he miscalculates. For kingship may be sanctified, but it is also political. In the unfolding arc of the 100 Years' War, internal division weakens external ambition. Henry returns from exile, while Richard campaigns in Ireland. Support gathers quickly around him. The tide turns not with roaring battle, but with shifting loyalty. Richard is deposed in 1399. The king who believed himself elevated above men finds himself imprisoned, eventually dying in confinement. Winter closes quietly around him. No grand clash, no triumphant procession, only the fading of a belief that kingship alone guarantees permanence. In this stillness, stoic reflection enters. Power is borrowed. Authority is conditional. Richard's tragedy is not merely political failure, but attachment to an image of rule untouched by change. The crown rests now upon Henry IV, formerly Bolingbroke, inaugurating the Lancastrian branch of the Plantagenets. But legitimacy, once contested, leaves lingering frost. The 100 Years' War has not ended. It waits. And in the quiet after Richard's fall, England prepares for another king who will redefine what authority looks like when winter truly arrives.
Winter does not arrive in a single gust. It settles slowly, frost forming first along the edges of stone before claiming the fields. After Richard II's fall, the crown rests uneasily upon Henry IV. His reign is marked by rebellion and illness, by the quiet strain of a throne taken rather than inherited without question. The 100 Years' War, suspended but never extinguished, waits like distant thunder beyond the Channel. And in that waiting, a prince matures. Henry of Monmouth grows not in luxury, but in expectation. He has seen the cost of contested legitimacy. He has witnessed how quickly loyalty can shift. In the broader arc of 5,600 years, his emergence marks not only a renewal of conflict, but a redefinition of kingship itself. When Henry V ascends the throne in 1413, he carries both burden and clarity. Unlike Richard II, he does not cloak himself in sacred distance. He cultivates proximity. He walks among soldiers. He listens. He understands that authority in winter must generate warmth, not aloofness. And so, when tensions with France reignite and his claim to the French crown is pressed forward, the march toward Agincourt begins not with pageantry, but with resolve. In 57 Battle of Agincourt accounts, historians often describe mud, exhaustion, and overwhelming odds. Yet before the clash, there is silence. The English army, reduced by disease and hunger, stands weary on sodden ground in October 1415. Rain has soaked the field. Armor feels heavier than iron. Across the narrow expanse, French forces outnumber them significantly. But again, it is the waiting that defines the moment. The wind carries the faint scent of wet earth. Boots sink slightly with each shift of stance. Longbowmen press their feet into mud for steadiness, and Henry V moves quietly among them. This is where memory blends history with myth. In later centuries, dramatists will immortalize his words as the 68 Henry V speech, the call to brotherhood on St. Crispin's Day. Whether spoken exactly as remembered or shaped by art, its essence remains. A king speaking not above his men, but with them. In our slow retelling, imagine Henry standing without flourish, rain tracing along his cheek. His voice not loud, but steady. He speaks of shared fate, of honor carried equally by noble and commoner. The mud at Agincourt levels hierarchy. Armor does not gleam, it darkens. The prince turned king understands that power in winter survives by solidarity. When the longbows rise once more, the sound returns, familiar yet transformed. Draw, pause, release. Arrows arc into gray sky. French cavalry struggles through mud, momentum lost. The English line holds. And in that measured persistence, the 57 Battle of Agincourt becomes legend. Yet legend is brief. The field grows quiet again. Henry's victory reshapes negotiations, leading eventually to the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, recognizing him as heir to the French throne. For a moment, the dream of union seems within reach, but winter remains unforgiving. Triumph carries fragility, and in that knowledge the stoic undertone deepens. No victory guarantees permanence. No speech secures eternity. The mud of Agincourt will dry. The echoes of the 68 Henry V speech will fade into parchment and stage. What remains is the lesson, that authority grounded in shared hardship burns warmer than authority claimed by divine right alone.
Winter does not celebrate victory. It preserves it in frost, fragile and temporary. After Agincourt, after the triumph that echoes through 57 Battle of Agincourt chronicles and later immortalized in the spirit of the 68 Henry V speech, Henry V stands at the height of power. The Treaty of Troyes names him heir to the French throne. He marries Catherine of Valois, binding two dynasties in ceremony and hope. For a brief, shimmering moment, it seems the long struggle of the 5,600 years' war may bend toward English dominance. Yet, history, like winter light, fades quickly toward dusk. Henry V does not live long enough to see the crown of France secured upon his head. In 1422, at only 35, he dies unexpectedly, likely from illness, leaving behind an infant son, Henry VI. The mud of Agincourt has dried, but the uncertainty it masked returns. The king who stood beside his soldiers, who walked among them not as distant sovereign but as comrade, is gone. And with his passing, the warmth of shared hardship cools once more into vulnerability. Imagine the great halls of Westminster and the corridors of French palaces now hushed. Tapestries hang still, candles burn low. The promise of union rests not in a seasoned ruler's hand, but in a cradle. The infant Henry VI inherits not only 2 crowns in theory, but the unresolved tension of decades. The stoic truth deepens here. No triumph, however brilliant, escapes time's quiet claim. Richard II believed himself ordained above men and fell into isolation. Henry V stood in mud beside his men in rows in unity, yet even he could not command mortality. Power shifts like winter wind across battlements. The Plantagenet dynasty, once so confident under Edward III, now stands at another fragile threshold. France will rally under new leadership. A peasant girl named Joan of Arc will rise years later to rekindle French resolve. The 100 Years' War will enter new phases of reversal and recovery. What Henry V achieved will be contested, eroded, challenged. In the long arc of 5,600 years' war, victory is never permanent. It is a season, and seasons turn. As we close this winter chapter, the imagery softens. Snow falls lightly upon the fields that once churned with armies. The longbows are stored. The speeches are remembered more for spirit than sound. In candlelit chambers, nobles whisper of regencies and guardianship. The child king sleeps, unaware of the burdens forming beyond the cradle's edge. And in that image lies the quiet philosophy of this era. Authority is not owned, it is carried briefly. The king who believed himself divine fades into shadow. The king who stood in mud becomes legend. Both are bound by the same impermanence. The 100 Years' War continues, not as endless fury, but as recurring winter. And as the frost settles once more over England and France, the Plantagenet story prepares for its most fragile chapters yet. The wind moves softly along stone walls, the torches dim, and in the stillness of a winter night, we are reminded that even the brightest flame flickers, and even the strongest crown rests lightly upon a mortal brow.
When red and white roses wither, a new dynasty quietly rises from the ashes. The winter of kings has not yet ended, but it begins to dissolve into something heavier than frost. It becomes exhaustion. The child Henry VI, who inherited 2 crowns in theory, grows into a man gentle in spirit but fragile in will. In the extended aftermath of the 100 Years' War, England no longer looks outward with the same unified resolve. Instead, it turns inward. Victory abroad fades, losses mount, France slips away, and within the English court, whispers sharpen into accusation. This is where the story of the Wars of the Roses begins, not as a single clash, but as accumulated grievance. The House of Lancaster, descended from Henry IV, holds the crown through Henry VI, yet the House of York, also Plantagenet by blood, questions his capacity to rule. Henry VI's periods of mental collapse deepen uncertainty. Government falters, factions solidify. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York become emblems of rivalry that is both personal and dynastic. Imagine England under a sky heavy with gray cloud. The fields are not foreign battlefields now, they are home. Castles that once guarded against France now guard against cousins. The longbow's hum is replaced by the quiet dread of shifting allegiance. In Wars of the Roses accounts, historians describe cycles of deposition and restoration. Henry VI is removed, Edward IV of York rises. Then Henry returns briefly, only to fall again. The crown becomes less symbol of stability and more prize of contest. Yet even here we remain in the quiet between storms. At Towton in 1461, snow falls over one of the bloodiest battles fought on English soil. But instead of focusing on carnage, imagine the snow absorbing sound. Armor dulled by frost, breath rising white against winter air. The battle ends, but peace does not follow immediately. Edward IV reigns with confidence, but the pattern of fracture remains. When he dies unexpectedly, his young sons become pawns in a struggle for guardianship. And from that uncertainty steps Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later crowned Richard III. Richard III remains one of the most debated figures in English history. In the quiet study of Tudor's origin, his reign appears brief yet consequential. He claims the throne in 1483, declaring his nephews illegitimate. The princes in the Tower vanish into silence, their fate uncertain, their absence echoing through centuries. Richard rules for only 2 years. He is described by some as capable and reform-minded, by others as ruthless. But in our soft telling, we see a man caught within a collapsing structure. The Plantagenet dynasty, once forged in continental ambition and strengthened by archers at Cressy and Agincourt, now turns blade upon itself. Loyalty fragments, nobles calculate survival, and beneath the heraldic roses, fatigue deepens. The storm gathers for its final reckoning.
The storm does not roar at first. It gathers in quiet resolve beneath gray skies. In the final turn of 54 Wars of the Roses, England approaches Bosworth Field in 1485, not as a nation marching toward glory, but as one seeking release from exhaustion. Richard III stands as the last Plantagenet king, his standard bearing the white boar fluttering against unsettled wind. Across the field, Henry Tudor advances with a smaller force but greater momentum of destiny. In the quiet study of Tudor's origin, historians often note how unlikely his claim once seemed. Descended through a distant Lancastrian line, exiled for years in Brittany and France, Henry Tudor did not appear inevitable. Yet history often favors the patient survivor rather than the obvious heir. Imagine Bosworth at dawn. The grass is damp, the air cool but no longer bitter with winter. This is not the frost of Towton. It is late summer, heavy with the scent of earth. Richard rides along his line, armor polished yet practical. He has known battle before. He understands the stakes. In later retellings, 48 Richard III is shaped by drama and debate, but here we see a man facing the narrowing path of circumstance. He knows loyalty is uncertain. The Stanleys, whose forces wait at the edge of engagement, remain ambiguous in allegiance. The field holds tension like a drawn bow that has been stretched for decades. When battle begins, it is swift and decisive. Richard makes a bold charge directly toward Henry Tudor, seeking to end the contest in a single stroke. It is a final assertion of Plantagenet will, a king fighting not behind ranks, but within them. Mud and dust rise, shouts blur into wind. Yet even here, in the closing clash,
we do not linger on violence. We focus on the moment when Richard falls, unhorsed, surrounded. The crown, as legend tells, later found among hawthorn branches. Whether embroidered by time or preserved in fact, the image endures, a fallen king beneath open sky. With Richard's death, the long arc that began with Henry II and the Angevin Empire comes to its end. The Plantagenet dynasty dissolves not in ceremony, but in consequence. Henry Tudor is crowned Henry VII upon the field, uniting red and white roses through marriage to Elizabeth of York. The Tudor rose blooms as symbol of reconciliation. In the broader reflection of 54 Wars of the Roses, Bosworth closes a cycle of internal fracture that had drained England for decades. The 100 Years' War had once turned ambition outward. The Wars of the Roses turned it inward. Now, at last, a measure of consolidation emerges. And so we return to the image promised at the beginning of this chapter. When red and white roses wither, a new dynasty rises quietly from ash. The storm passes not with thunder, but with gradual clearing. Fields that once trembled under armored men grow still. Castles stand, weathered but intact. The Tudors will usher in a different age, one of centralization and Renaissance stirrings. Yet even their story carries impermanence, for all dynasties fade in time. As we close this final chapter of the Plantagenets, the tone softens into rest. The roses no longer clash. The wind moves gently through summer grass at Bosworth. The channel reflects moonlight without warships. The longbows are silent, and in this stillness, the lesson settles gently. Every crown rests lightly. Every storm eventually breaks, and every dynasty, no matter how fierce, yields to mourning. Sleep now beneath that quiet sky. The war has ended, the roses have fallen, and history for this night is at peace. Good night.